So let me just give a brief introduction to our guest this morning or this afternoon, again, wherever you're at. The first thing you need to know is that our guest speaker was born in Australia, but is living in the UK, and along with those British sensibilities, she doesn't like long introductions, so I won't brag on her too much. But our guest is the Associate Secretary General for Church and Community, which is part of the World Evangelical Alliance. And for those of you who may not know, the WEA is an organization that serves over 600 million evangelical Christians in about 129 different countries. And our guest has, more importantly than these titles, had about 16 years of experience in networking and helping churches collaborate and other organizations work together. But she doesn't just sit in an office somewhere. I really appreciated that, as you see on your screen there, a little information about her, this line where it says she is involved in local church leadership. She's not sitting in an office just thinking great thoughts. She's putting this into practice. And lastly, I would just add about her family. She does have a husband who practices law, so we will not make any lawyer jokes today. And she has two grown children who work as architects there in the UK. And most importantly, she does have two grandsons. And she today is coming to us from Australia, where she goes back to visit a few times a year. So welcome with me, Amanda Jackson. Amanda, we're happy to have you, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Daniel. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm sure I'll get a message if you can't. It's great to be involved. It's great to be a great honor to be asked to speak with you from all around the world. We're talking today about how networks can make churches more effective. And that's the concern of the WEA, but I'm sure it's the concern of many of us who run networks, something that we can get a bit distracted from on occasions because we like to run a very good network, and churches might be just a messy part of our job rather than the actual raison d'etre for it. I have worked in networking for many years, and sometimes, you know, I would love to just be a benevolent dictator and get my work done and people listening to me without the necessity to listen and network and compromise and take things slowly. And I'm sure some of you might identify with that. But at the same time, we all know that networks are a great way to bring people together, to hear other voices, to listen, to learn, and ultimately to do things better, because we are, I guess, demonstrating the characteristics of the kingdom when we're networking. I've done campaigning work in a network. I've done development work in a network. And now I help other networks to network better. So it's a challenge, but a great one. So last year I was in Myanmar. I wanted to tell a couple of stories about why networks can make churches more effective and how they do it. Last year I was in Myanmar, which is a brand fairly newly democratic country. It's still grappling with democracy. But in the last year, since Aung San Suu Kyi was elected as the sort of proto-president, mission groups and Christian groups have flooded into the nation. They see an opportunity. And how do the churches cope with that? And how do they get the best out of that is a really interesting question. So I was there to train women in 2 cities about leadership and how to do things strategically. Because for the church, when you are bombarded with networks and international organizations, part of the issue is how to think, God, which way are you taking us, and which way would be the best way for what we want to achieve? And I guess working through the Evangelical Alliance in that case really helps to overcome silos. And the church has been very isolated in Myanmar. So now when the outside world is knocking on the door, it is helpful to have one group, I guess, being a gatekeeper for all those different groups and meeting common needs as well. So many small churches don't know a great deal about what to do about refugees or poverty or the teenagers in their church or educating women. So doing it together makes sense. And I just wanted to mention too that churches locally face big issues, and sometimes networks can help them to work out how to approach those issues because they've seen how it works in other places. And for the people in Myanmar, the Rohingya is a huge issue. Some of you may have read about it, seen it on TV. It's just one of the many human disasters that is happening around our world. The Rohingya is a minority ethnic group, and they are displaced people. They are not recognised as citizens in Myanmar at all. And that is an ongoing problem for the new government as well as the old. And how churches respond to that, because the Rohingya are a Muslim group, so how do Christians respond to that issue when they've got big things facing them themselves? How do they reach out with a positive Christian message is something I think networks can help with. One of the great things I noticed was a good example of networking, and that was how the Billy Graham organisation was operating in Myanmar when I was there. They were just about 3 weeks away from having big evangelism crusades. And Billy Graham organisation had been there for 2 years prior to the actual events, and it was staying around for another 12 months. And so I think that's avoiding one of the dangers of networks or big organizations coming in, is that they come in, they brainstorm, they make a big impact, and then they go away and it's all forgotten and everybody moves on to the next big thing. So I think that's, again, something we might want to delve into about networks, and if you are an international player, how you can be sensitive to the local church whilst also trying to bring what you have internationally. And that was also seen in theological training in Myanmar. Over the years of isolation, tiny little theological colleges have sprung up with maybe 20 students in a small place out in the country. And now they're thinking, well, how can we make sure those colleges are connected so that they can do their work better, so that we can make sure there's quality control over the teaching? So I guess I'm telling that story because it's an example of how networking together within the nation and also bringing in money and expertise from other places can help improve quality and can help improve effectiveness. And in Myanmar, it was the Evangelical Alliance that provided that common point of contact and acted as a way to link agencies and networks with what was going on locally. Another example from a development point of view this time, and I don't know whether any of you are involved in development work. Maybe you'll be able to send a little message or a question about that or a comment. East Timor, or Timor-Leste, another tiny country. For some of you, you may not know where it is. It's part of the Indonesian archipelago, and about 15 years ago, they won hard-won independence from the Indonesians. And when the Indonesians left, they created havoc and they basically destroyed everything that they could destroy in the nation. It was very sad. And I think Indonesia probably wouldn't behave like that now, but they did then. And there was nothing left, no infrastructure, no schools, very few public buildings at all were left standing. And the approach of the development charities was really innovative and very positive, because it's a small place and because the place had very little governance at all left. The charities got together, the development agencies got together with the government, and they worked out a program of making sure that there was very little duplication, that money was spent wisely, that there was very little opportunity for corruption, which is always a real issue when you go in to do emergency work. So the benefits of working together, of networking, in other words, could bring those groups together in a non-threatening way, in a way that was able to lay aside all the risks of people working together, loss of brand and loss of being able to boast about what you were doing and changing lives, it was wonderful that, one agency said, oh, we'll do the toilets. And, that's not a very sexy thing to raise money over, but they did it. And one group did other things. And it was a very effective example of a nation in crisis being really helped by global networks coming in not to impose, but to work with. So what are the value of global networks? I'm sure some of you do work with networks, and it'll be interesting in the poll question, you'll be able to answer that. Well, I'm sure lots of you can give off some of these points as well, but let's go through some of them. They bring a lot of organizations together to engage a region or an area or a topic or an issue. And in coming together, you get the ability to filter all those issues and prioritize for a particular case or a particular nation. Networks bring the ability to train because they're not so concentrated on the everyday work on the ground. They're one step removed, and so they can see the needs at a bit of a different level and can train and think a bit maybe longer term as well. Obviously, they bring an international perspective, they bring a global perspective, and they understand global issues. And that can be very refreshing for people, again, who have a very local perspective, to understand maybe that we're not the only ones in the world who are suffering from this problem. Maybe some of the things that we've been concentrating on, maybe we could do it a little bit differently. All sorts of advantages to having a global perspective. Effective networks can avoid the problems that money can bring. Money can bring great benefits, but it can also distort priorities. And so if you're networking effectively, then no one organization with one priority can dominate. It means that everyone has a voice and the chance to dance on a dance floor that's been set up by the network. And the salsa doesn't become the all-consuming dance. There's room for other dances as well, hip-hop and waltz. And that's the value of a network. I myself am an expert at hip-hop, in case you wanted to know. So we learn to have connections when we're a good network. We learn to listen. We learn to value others. Our big strength, as I mentioned in East Timor, is that you avoid complication and duplication of doing things, which is a huge risk when lots and lots of groups and networks descend on a local church situation and they're not quite sure how to say no or yes or maybe. And then, as I mentioned before about waltzes and salsas, the value of a network, a good network, is that it brings northern and southern perspectives together and listens equally to both and doesn't assume that one is more important or more valuable than the other. And that I've seen very effectively working in campaigning, that we need to listen to the voices of all. We're going to go on to section 2. And I've been talking a little bit about dancing. One of the ways we talk about networks sometimes is to say that we invite people to a table, which is a good analogy for networking. But then about 18 months ago, I think it was through one of the networks I'm involved with, someone referred to it as, what does a network do? It provides a dance floor for people to come onto to dance together. And I thought that was a wonderful analogy and better than the table, because a table, when you're sitting at a table, it's quite a static thing, whereas a network is enabling people to get on and do their job of dancing more effectively. So I really like that analogy. And Ben has offered to demonstrate a dance for us later on at the end whilst we're dealing with the discussion. If we're dancing to try to make churches healthier and more effective, someone asked me, well, what does a healthy church look like in your context of networking? Now, we could all produce points about what makes a healthy church in terms of Bible reading and evangelism and youth work and things like that. But if we're talking about if a church is open to and willing to and benefiting from networks, what would it look like? And I've just got some points here, and it'd be interesting to hear whether you agree with this list or have extra things to add as well. The first thing I think is that it responds to the needs of the community with integrated mission. I don't know whether you're familiar with that term, but really what it means is that we respond with the word, with preaching the word, with evangelism. We respond with social action and social justice, and we respond with signs and wonders, with miracles, with powerful intercessory prayer, with the spiritual side of the battle, as well as responding physically and with the word. Effective churches do all three. An effective, healthy church is prepared to give and take and be gracious when it gets together with other churches. I'm sure we've all been part of or involved with or had something to do with mega churches, which sometimes feel that perhaps they don't need to dance with anybody else because they're doing a wonderful dance over in the corner by themselves, and it's a really beautiful dance. And so what's the point of dancing with anybody else? But if we're going to work effectively and be a healthy church in terms of working with other churches in our community to see the kingdom grow, I think we're prepared to give and take and be gracious. I've already mentioned prayer. Prayer is key. And I think sometimes when we're networking, we want to be effective. We're doers. And we sometimes forget that prayer is vital and covers everything and makes our job easier because we've got spiritual warfare happening, and then we can go in on the back of prayer. A healthy church that's networking well is clever, but it's also innocent. So it's aware of the world and the way things operate. It's aware of how to communicate effectively, how to be politically astute, but it's also innocent in a way. You remember Paul says that the wisdom of man is nothing compared to even the stupidity of God. And so as Christians, we sometimes need to be seen as innocent because that preserves us in a way from being corrupted by the world. Another aspect of a healthy church, I think, is that it uses young people and women effectively. It actively encourages their engagement and their leadership. Way too many churches are run by wonderful older men who want to hang on to their position and their power. They're very good. They've done amazing things, but they can't let go. And a healthy church that is networking is really willing to respond to that and to say to young people, take off, take this idea and run with it. A healthy church responds to God's urgings on size and character rather than following a formula. And I think this is one of the risks of churches inviting in big international groups as well. I do want to stress the positive about networks, but sometimes there are some dangers as well. And international groups can sometimes come in with the perfect formula for something. If you just buy my books, if you buy my videos, if you follow my website and probably pay some money, then you will be guaranteed success on this particular issue. And of course, a healthy church needs to weigh that up. Do we want to just have growth? Do we want to be a character-filled and close to God type church, just as much as inviting in the latest international speaker? A healthy and good, well-networked church, or a church that's prepared to network, understands different cultures. That is so pertinent today, especially. Practically every church has different cultures in it now, certainly urban churches, and wherever they are in the world. And we need to be accommodating to that, to understand our culture, to understand different cultures, and to know when culture is getting in the way of God and when culture is a useful tool for God. A healthy church avoids slipping into a ghetto, thinking that we're doing okay, we're doing things the right way, we're successful, and we're going to get more successful, and we don't have to work with anybody else. And understanding when to change and when to accept and when to challenge the world around us is linked with those two previous points, I think, about culture, about being in a ghetto, about being prepared to listen to new things and to weigh them up and to understand them. And it was interesting. I think one of my friends has a great expression that we should live out our faith and our leadership with the Bible in one hand and a newspaper, or maybe these days an iPad, in the other, so that we understand the world, but we're always understanding it through the lens of the Bible. And again, a healthy church, which is networking well, strongly focuses on discipleship. And by that I mean the depth of our understanding of faith and what church means, rather than just success at a shallower level. And how can networks work? Well, and how can they help those churches to be more effective? Again, let's go through some points that I've discovered in my experience and see if you agree. Not much of this stuff comes from books, I'm afraid, and books can be really helpful, but my experience mainly is just practical and on the ground, and see what you think. Networks can help churches come together on the dance floor. They can invite people into a safer space, and then you can experience all sorts of new things and wonderful ways of dancing. Networks help churches see that different contributions are valuable. There is no one body part that can do it all. And again, I think sometimes in our denominations or in our independent church networks, we feel that we've got the total answer. And networks help us to see that, in fact, we're part of the answer, and that mainstream traditional churches have something to offer, Pentecostal churches have something to offer. We all bring something to the dance floor that is beautiful. And if we're bringing something that isn't beautiful, we can look at others and learn and appreciate their beauty. Networks remind us that we're not the first to face an issue. And I'm sure you'll find this in your experience. No one ever says to you, evangelism is so easy in our area. No one ever says that. No one ever says, oh, talking to government is so easy in my country. Bringing people together is so easy. Everyone talks about the difficulties. And so a network can give us the music and the dance steps, perhaps a new partner, mood lighting, to hide some of the ugliness and to show up some of the beauty, and remind us that we can actually face issues more creatively through a network. Global networks, by definition, will seem big, though in fact they may not be. They may just be two people sitting at home working globally. But the response from local churches can be either resentment or fawning and copying a formula. And so networks need to be aware of that and to approach with humility and to say, you don't have to resent somebody coming in with a new voice. Actually, we're here to help and to serve and to offer something to you. Networks can help us overcome cultural Christianity by showing us different things on that dance floor. And I think sometimes when we work cross-culturally, we're very aware of cultures, and that's a really good thing. But we should never allow culture to be an excuse to not facing the truth, to not doing things God's way, to compromising so much with culture that we become less effective for God. One of the things that I've been involved with over the years is advocacy work politically and in the public sphere. And networks really are the only way to help us speak with a united Christian voice. Otherwise, it's far too easy for politicians to divide and conquer and to pit churches and against each other. And if we come with a united voice, then that makes it much easier to be effective. It also means that we're willing to put aside our differences. And I really appreciate that when Jesus prayed for what was going to become the church, when he prayed for his disciples just before he was about to leave them, he didn't pray about correct theology. He didn't pray about training and equipping. He prayed for unity because he knew that that would be the danger. And so networks can help us to speak and to be united. And lastly, I think I have found in my experience that it's really encouraging for local churches, for churches in a small nation, for churches in a community, to feel part of the bigger kingdom is very encouraging for them and helps them to do their job more effectively and helps them to reach out to others because they can see that, there is a different perspective. And lastly, very quickly, I was asked to talk particularly about women because I'm quite passionate about the involvement and the leadership of women in the church and in networks. When I am part of networks or I go and visit other networks, it is still quite unusual to find women at the top or in leadership roles in those networks. And I would urge all of us to think that women and young people, but I'm going to concentrate on women on this slide, to think that they can offer something to the dance that's very important. Well, for a start, most dances take place with men and women in partnership. So what can women bring? Because traditionally women are outside, power structures, actually women can disrupt and disarm. And that can be a very valuable thing. They can say things and do things that actually go round and under and over and through tradition and the limitations of those things. I think women are more willing to work together because they have more to gain together. Perhaps they have less to lose by working together. Maybe that will change. If women ever do get to total equality, maybe they'll become just as guarded about their positions of power. But I think for the most part, women are talkers as well, and they do work together. They're a grassroots voice, and we need to listen to those grassroots voices. They make our networking more effective. They make our church work more effective. Women have a concern for their children, for the next generation. I think that's, you talk to every woman and she's still very concerned for family issues. And I don't mean that in a, sort of putting down sense. There's nothing wrong with being concerned with family, with being concerned for children in the church and in networks. They're willing to give time and talent, and sometimes they do have extra time in many contexts because they're not working outside the home for a living. They may be able to devote more time. But they're willing to give time. And again, even though women are amazingly busy and juggle many responsibilities, they still seem to find time to give to the church and to networks. Women are prayers. All statistics show that women are the ones who pray in church. And sometimes if they're able to do work of leadership in a church, it is around prayer. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for them to be really feeding in both ways, hearing from God and also telling people what God is saying. They understand the power of story, and that's a very important thing in bringing people into a network. The power of being able to talk about the dance floor rather than to talk about strategic plans or charts or those sorts of things. You encourage people to come in and be involved, and then you get strategic. But I think story is a very powerful thing. And lastly, I think women understand sacrifice. And maybe perhaps not so much in the Western context where there's greater equality and greater power for women. It's more equal. And I'm not saying that men don't understand these things, please don't get me wrong, but I do think that women have something quite special to offer. Okay, last section. You'll be pleased to know that this last section is the shortest one. When Daniel and I were talking about our work and about networking and equipping the local church, we decided that it would be really good to talk about some of the challenges, the things that trip us up on the dance floor. And some of them I've already hinted at, but I wanted to just go through some of those things directly and to see whether that's your experience as well. And if we're looking out for those things that are going to trip us up, then of course it's easier to avoid tripping. The first one is leadership. Leadership is vital, obviously, good leadership, but too often leadership in the church, unfortunately, and in networks and in Christian contexts succumbs to leadership everywhere in the secular world, and that is that we are interested in our ego, we're interested in our power, we're interested in rivalry, and networks want to be aware of that as they come into a situation, and they want to avoid it themselves. And I think one of the things that perhaps is forced on us when we work together in a network is humility and cooperation. And we need to be aware that those things have great advantages rather than just disadvantage. And we need to promote humble, servant-hearted leadership in networks and to demonstrate those things when we're working with churches, when we're working with other networks, when we're working with organizations, particularly organizations and churches that have perhaps a more Western way of thinking, where branding and image are really, really important, and where the marketing department dominates. We need to be stressing that our way of operating is more giving than that. Another challenge is that it's in fact probably easier to keep working in my silo, doing things my way with my traditions. As I joked at the beginning, you know, being a benevolent dictator in my little world is easier than working with other people, in having to compromise. And so as a network, if you are involved in a network, it'd be really good to maybe have the opportunity, maybe that's some of the questions or comments we can give, how we overcome the reluctance of people to get involved. Sometimes people say, oh, I haven't got time to be involved. You know, I've got my work to do. That's my priority, is to do my core tasks rather than getting involved in other things and networking with other people, working together. And that is a legitimate concern, but we need, once we've got involved in a network, hopefully we see that it adds so much more to the value of what we do. I've already talked about the next one, that sometimes we value brand and marketing over collaboration, and we need to be very wary of that when we're working together. When I was running an advocacy campaign in Australia, every year we took a large group of Christians, everyday Christians, to the capital city, Canberra, to do advocacy work on behalf of the global poor. And we had about 15 different NGOs and church denominations involved in that campaigning work. And we said to every one of them that they were not allowed to wear T-shirts, sloppy joes, you know, jumpers that had their brand on it. The only brand that we saw was the brand of the campaign. And that was important in being united and in working out that it was more valuable to be dancing together on this occasion than to be promoting our own particular view of dance. I think we have to be aware that money distorts relationships and creates inequality. And if we're part of a global network, that's particularly true. going into a place where perhaps we might not think we have much money. Nobody ever does think they've got a lot of money. But compared with some of the places that we go into, we do have, and we're perceived to have, great resources and great funding. And money can distort relationships. People say yes when perhaps they might not really believe that they should be saying yes, but because they think they're going to get something out of that relationship in terms of resource, and because they think that perhaps if they don't say yes, the money might dry up. And we have to be very wary of that when we're working and going in to work with churches, that we're not seen as some God bringing great resource at the risk of their independence. Working together can produce competition, and gossip and legalism can get in the way. Working out what's going to make a good partnership on the dance floor is very important. So we come together, we do a couple of dances, we think, yeah, well, this is working well, I quite like this, and it's looking good. And then that's the time to really sort out what you're going to do from now on. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it avoids problems later on. It avoids competition. It avoids, oh, I never agreed to that. Whereas if we can actually say, well, yes, we did agree to do this together. We did agree to avoid this. We did agree not to talk about this. We did agree that this person was going to be our voice for the campaign or whatever. I think all of those things can be worked out to avoid complications later on. A risk of networks and coming together is that we concentrate more on what divides us and not what unites us. And the beauty of a network is it allows us to see other people and to appreciate them. The danger is that we don't like what we see and we go away more determined than ever not to work with other people. And so we need to be very gracious and to be always acknowledging what people are contributing and what they're bringing to the dance floor, rather than complaining about what they're not bringing. Lots of networks come together to do things, and that's good. They come together to do social action a lot, especially around development, around overcoming poverty, around overcoming inequality, around education issues, or around a social issue or ill. And that's great. And it's a way of bringing people onto the dance floor and forgetting about the theology just for a minute. But sometimes the risk is, of course, that evangelism gets pushed aside. We discover the joy and wonder of contributing to our community socially and in a practical way. And we forget that, remember, we're meant to be practicing integral mission, which is the word and works and wonders coming together. And so we need to be aware of that. I've also seen networks crash into situations without any sensitivity, and we need to be so aware of that. Culturally, spiritually, men versus women, young versus old, and we need to do our homework, we need to do our research. Remember, we need to have that iPad in one hand and the Bible in the other. And we should avoid bringing our prejudices to the dance floor. Because, as I said, if we're a network and we're big, we run the risk of being listened to for the not right reasons, for the wrong reasons. And we need to be very aware that we come with a listening heart rather than a talking heart. And sometimes global perspectives can crush legitimate local ideas. As outsiders, we think we understand what's happening at a local level. And we do have a global perspective, and that's very valuable. But sometimes the local things are just imperative at the time and need to be addressed. And we'll come back to the global things later when we've sorted out these really important local issues. Now, networking can, of course, help to sort those local issues and ideas and challenges and provide ways of dealing with them. But we need to perhaps lay aside the bigger questions and deal with the little questions that we discover. When Paul wrote his letters to the churches, sometimes it was the very little things that were getting in the way of running a successful church. And he dealt with them. He dealt with them openly and honestly and plainly. And that's what good networks can do as well.